Suffolk started to move past the windows as Hudson settled into his seat. He glanced out the window of a train and tried to slow his breathing. Traffic had been bad. He'd almost missed the train. Added to that fact, he'd woken late thanks to old batteries in his alarm clock, and Marjorie had just slumbered on relentlessly, even when he'd kneed her in the ribs whilst clambering over her sprawled body. His body felt coated in sweat beneath his suit and overcoat. Though the early morning skies were grey as slate and carried, as they had done for the better part of the last fortnight, the threat of rain, it was unbearably hot. Once he got to the office he could relax, remove his coat and jacket, unbutton his collar, roll up his sleeves, and then it would be on with the day's work. He looked back along the carriage at the scattered faces, some vaguely familiar from his weekday journeys, others less so. All looked bleary-eyed and dazed, and he lingered least on those faces that stared back at him. The town where he lived was dragged reluctantly away as the train gathered speed and headed into the countryside, factories and warehouses dotting the landscape, revealing the occasional promise of open fields and farmland. Hudson felt a little better now, and last night's argument with his wife had almost slipped completely from his mind. It was his fault, of course. Marjorie was a dear and always had been. He glanced at his vague, ghostly reflection in the glass as the train sped into the darkness of a tunnel, its horn bellowing a warning. His eyes looked heavily bagged as though sleeping in hammocks of wrinkled flesh, his jowls heavy behind his greying beard, and his hairline receded to the point where he was now referred to by most as a bald person. He was getting old, and he was feeling grouchy, and it was as simple as that. Hudson reflected upon his life, how his boyhood dreams had been put off year after year, and how he was now much too old to even consider living them out. The things he'd always wanted to do and the places that he'd always wanted to go had been left behind, like the fields that the train cut across, out of reach. No going back. He glanced up as somebody walked slowly along the carriage, a tall man dressed in a black overcoat, but his head was down to the floor, so Hudson didn't give him a second thought. He'd order some flowers to be delivered to the house, roses, a dozen red roses for his English rose. He smiled, watched his face crumple in the glass, and then turned away from it. The stranger in the black overcoat was looking straight at him, having settled into a seat facing the opposite direction. His face was long and gaunt and topped with sleek grey hair. He had a hooked nose lending him a predatory air, and a cruel, thin-lipped mouth. His eyes looked black as his clothes, and as Hudson stared, the stranger raised his head in acknowledgement and smiled. Flustered, Hudson twitched a half-smile in reply before turning away. The countryside seemed flat and endless, various shades of yellows, browns and greens. He closed his eyes, and then they opened again, for he had seen something other than the colour of fields out there. Somebody was running across the fields towards the tracks, arms flailing as though trying to attract attention. Corn waved like the sea all around the fleeing figure, and before distance made it impossible to see any more, Hudson realised that the person was being pursued, or at least followed, for something was rushing up fast behind them through the corn. He thought no more about it for the rest of the day. He sat at his desk in the badly air-conditioned office, scratching at his neck, which felt irritated by his shirt collar, until people stared at him. Several times he stomped off to the water fountain down the corridor and told himself off for his increasingly bad mood and brusque manners. His hand hovered over the payphone in the corridor as the number of a shop where Marjorie worked trooped through his head, but every time he tried to think of what he would say when she answered, he just saw his mouth flapping like a fish out of water. On the train home, he read the evening news, keeping his face down despite the feeling that he was being watched. Whenever the train pulled into a station, he would raise his head and quickly glance around the carriage, but if anyone was watching him, then they were well concealed in the crowded train. Marjorie had made a lovely dinner for them both as a thank you for the flowers which were proudly displayed in her best crystal vase in the centre of a dining table. Sam was asleep in bed, having worn himself out at the school sports day. Hudson crept into the boy's room and pecked him a quick kiss before going back down to dinner. As he chewed through his steak, Marjorie's eyes twinkled at him, and he couldn't help but smile at her in return. Afterwards, they listened to Mozart in the lounge, and he felt relaxed enough to tell her how much he loved her, had always loved her. It was a good life, he thought, as they drifted off to sleep after making love for the first time in a few weeks, and he didn't want to lose any of this. He was waiting for the train the following Monday with plenty of time to spare, and thinking back over the most pleasant weekend he'd had in recent memory. A trip to the theatre to see a play that was so plagued by mistakes they'd howled with laughter. Taking Sam out to a park on Sunday where Hudson had almost been able to forget his age and waistline and run around and kick a ball until the heat had chased him to a table outside a nearby pub where he and Marjorie had drunk themselves docile and Sam had drifted off to sleep, curled up on the bench as the day turned darker. The train groaned alongside the platform and Hudson stepped into the nearest carriage. When he noticed the stranger in the black overcoat staring at him with dark and piercing eyes, he smiled back for a moment until a feeling reached him like somebody had poured a bucket of ice down the back of his shirt. Suddenly, he recognized the man from last week, and he got the feeling that the man recognized him just as well. Hudson glanced down at his knees, the briefcase pressed between them like the filling of an unappetizing sandwich. Why he should feel bothered about a fellow passenger recognizing him, he wasn't sure, but he just didn't care for the look of the man. At the next station, more early morning travellers pushed on, and through the newcomers it was hard to see the tall stranger, at least until he stood up, his head ducked low to avoid the ceiling, and stalked his way towards the rear of a carriage. Of course, the train wasn't about to stop. The man must want to use the WC. Hudson flushed red, feeling embarrassed at the realization. He imagined the gaunt figure folded into the tiny lavatory, but instead of being laughably ridiculous, the image just seemed disturbing. He imagined the other like a long-legged spider crouched in its lair, waiting for prey to walk past outside the door. As if to taunt him, Hudson's bladder twinged, and he held it in uncomfortably all the way to the office. Because of that, he started off his working week in yet another bad mood, and this only served to annoy him more and more. As the day wore on, circumstance did little to enlighten him. Storm clouds, pregnant with rain, brought a premature darkness to his homeward journey. He watched his reflection grow glummer with each passing mile, until the expression looked as though it wanted to slide off his face. Though he had the feeling that somebody was staring right at him, he couldn't bring himself to look. At his station, he thought that he was being followed in the subway onto the street, but when he turned and looked and saw the long tiled corridor was empty, he thought it must have only been an echo. He drove home and went straight to bed, where he lay gazing at the ceiling for most of the night, pretending to doze whenever Marjorie woke and turned towards him. Perhaps a holiday was what he needed to destroy this feeling that he was sinking deeper and deeper into a prison of his own foul moods. On his lunch hour the next day, he prowled up and down the high street, standing outside the windows of travel agents until he felt self-conscious enough to be driven inside and pile his arms with thick, glossy brochures. He returned to the office and shoveled them into his briefcase, and the thought of flipping through them on the train home made the day seem to go quicker. The gaunt stranger smirked at him as soon as he stepped onto the train. Hudson turned, but this was the last carriage, and it would look as though he were fleeing if he walked the length of it to step through into another one. Instead, he sat down where he was, putting some distance and a handful of other people between them. He ducked his head behind the seat so that the stranger couldn't see his every movement, and pulled out a handful of the holiday brochures. Greece beckoned with its tiny islands and blue waters. Italy invited him with rolling brown hills and sun-soaked villages. He rested his head and closed his eyes, recalling the last times he'd been to both of them. Happier days, when he was younger and slimmer and more comfortable with the man that he had been then. When he opened his eyes, the stranger was pointing at him. Hudson scowled, then his head turned as the pointing finger changed direction and guided his eyes towards the window. Out in the early evening, fields rushed by. Shadows toned down their natural colours, but hadn't darkened them enough for him not to see the two figures dashing through the corn towards him. Immediately, Hudson turned back to glower, but the man had risen on his stilt-like legs to walk off to wherever it was that he went to. By the time Hudson glanced back to the window, the figures had shrunk to insects, then to nothing. There was something not right about the scene, and particularly about the stranger directing his attention towards it. What the devil had the man meant by it? He thought back to the last time he'd witnessed the chase and how the stranger had been present then. Coincidence? It had to be, but yet it seemed something more than that. There was desperation in the fleeing figure and determination and purpose in that of the pursuer. Not to mention just that awful gut feeling that something wrong was taking place out there in the corn. It was still on his mind as he rushed through the subway and towards the car park. A homeless person had been lingering around the mouth of a subway, and the light above their head had been broken, dousing them in shadow. Cold, glimmering eyes watched Hudson pass, and only when he was safely locked into his car and driving home did his heart finally do anything less than pound against his chest. The house was filled with music as he locked the front door securely behind him. He was annoyed at Marjorie for not having locked it already. He checked the lock 3 times before hanging up his overcoat and jacket and walking on through to the lounge. Mozart was on the stereo, and Marjorie was curled into the sofa with a glass of wine. She looked up at him with a smile. "Thank you for the flowers," she said. "What flowers?" Hudson asked, his body tense. He knew she wouldn't still be thanking him from last week. "The black roses. They were waiting for me on the doorstep when I got home." A chill washed over his body, and he could feel his hair standing on end. He had the vision of a doorstep, his doorstep, with the roses lying upon it, waiting for somebody to claim them. Again, he felt plagued by the feeling of something not quite right, but there had to be an innocent explanation. Already, Marjorie was curious. "You didn't send them, did you?" she asked, slithering into an upright position. Hudson felt his body drain of energy, and he collapsed beside her, tugging at his collar like a man in a noose. The shadows seemed too thick, and the ones outside the window too eager to press themselves against the glass. It was no surprise that his sleep was restless and plagued by nightmares. He saw a tall and spindly figure as black as the night, stalking through endless fields of corn, plucking stalks of it from the ground and weaving them into a human figure in its skeletal hands. By the morning, he was determined to do something about the man on the train. He got to the station and waited on the platform with the others. Small assortment of bleary-eyed workers heading off into the city, like himself. The sky was pale, as though bled of colour, but still tinged with darkness towards the horizon, or it dipped behind the factories, as though the buildings were casting their shadows upon it. The train was 7 minutes late, and already annoyance had mixed in with his anger at the stranger, and the dreams and the flowers. As soon as he saw the man sitting just by the doors where Hudson stepped on, as though inviting him to take a seat, he felt unable to breathe. Thoughts of confrontation writhed in his mind as he stomped to the opposite end of a carriage. He would have gone through into the next one, but he knew that something had to be done. He just didn't know what, yet. He sat down and propped his briefcase on his lap like a shield. The train rumbled into life and began to gallop down the tracks, dragging the clouds in the sky along with it, but not the station or the town. Hudson stared out as the fields began to fill the window, then shut his eyes tight for fear of seeing an anonymous figure being pursued, then opened them again for fear of what might creep up on him when he wasn't looking. The stranger grinned across at him and nodded his skull-like head. Last week, hadn't he had swept-back silver hair? This week he had none. His skull looked lumpy and patched like the moon. He looked as though he'd aged 10 years in so many days. Hudson shuddered and turned away before the other man could point at anything he wouldn't want to see. There was something wrong with him. Of course there was. One only had to look at the man to see that. He glanced down at his watch and urged time onwards. Perhaps he could think it over at the office, and then if he saw the man again he could take action, and if he didn't then no action would be needed. He thought again of the flowers somebody had left for Marjorie. Roses. Fields swam by outside the window, but he wouldn't let his attention be drawn by any movement out there, just farm workers, he told himself, or blackbirds, or anything, I don't care. When his stop came, he was dreading the stranger rising up on those spider-like legs of his and stalking after him, clutching some corn effigy in his hands. Ridiculous. Ridiculous, of course it was, but the vision urged him onwards, and when he was on the platform, he rushed forwards towards a barrier where there were other people before turning to look back at the train. The man was still on it. Hudson could see his gaunt profile clearly through the glass. He was alone in the carriage. In fact, the train now had only a few passengers, being almost the end of the line. As Hudson watched, the train began to pull out, and the stranger turned his head and raised a hand with unnaturally long fingers to wave. Surely it had only been sunlight reflected upon the glass, and not something made of corn that the other had clutched in his hand? But of course it was still early morning, and the sun wasn't yet high enough to peer over the top of the station behind him. Hudson turned and hurried through the station, as though it were a portal back to reality, and into the reassuring noise of a city. All that morning at the office he felt on edge, as though waiting for something. When Rushton came in from his lunch break, he finally realised what it must have been. "Did you hear about the train crash?" he asked. And Hudson didn't need telling which train it had been. He listened, blank-faced and silent, whilst his colleagues discussed the news. Yes, it had been the same train. Gone off the rails just after pulling out of the city, crashed into an old abandoned rail warehouse and exploded. No survivors found. Despite the tragedy, Hudson immediately saw the silver lining and didn't feel too guilty about it. No survivors meant that the stranger was dead. It could have been me. For words played over and over again in his mind all day long and in the expensive taxi ride home that evening. Marjorie hadn't even heard yet and was shocked to tears when he explained. Hudson felt almost like laughing out loud, but it was an undoubted tragedy. There had still been innocent people upon that train, and the stranger himself, however ill, surely hadn't deserved to die in so horrendous a fashion. He couldn't sleep that night and didn't go into work the following day. He began to pray for the first time since he'd married aimlessly. He just prayed and hoped that it would help. When eventually he bullied himself into going back to work, Marjorie protested with her silence. Ever since the day of the accident, she'd been acting funny, and still every time he looked at her, he was unable to get the anonymous flowers out of his mind. Had he ever really considered the possibility that the stranger upon the train had left them for her? He had, he knew, but he'd been stupid. Maybe there was somebody else, somebody she worked with, or who used the shop, or... He watched her from a corner of his eye, unable to ask, and froze every time he saw her with Sam. He waited patiently upon the platform in the rain, his heart pounding. There were only two others waiting with him, and their features looked washed away either by the rain or by his lack of sleep. Maybe the accident had scared others away too. There was a low rumble, then a grating shriek, and the train pulled into sight and sidled against the platform. Hudson trotted on board, missing the rush of bodies, the feeling of liveliness. The train crash had seemed to bleed the summer of all life and washed away most of his anger towards himself and his life. He felt like a clockwork toy that was winding down, ready to be put away. He glanced along the carriage, but no dark stranger sat staring at him, ready to point or rise and stalk. For the next 10 minutes, he studied the back of a seat opposite until he started to feel that his whole life had been lived amongst the blue and red woven threads. Here, a cigarette burn was a volcano upon his landscape. A threadbare patch was a derelict corner of his world, a sad place where he could go with his memories. Here he was alone, not a married man, not a family man, not a father. Just him, even a man without a name. He wondered what Marjorie would think if he never came home and for how long Sam would cry, but let the idle thoughts drift like litter on a breeze. He felt weariness tugging his eyelids shut, and darkness washed over him. His eyes snapped open as he realised that it hadn't been the dark embrace of sleep. Somebody tall and dressed in black had passed him. He turned stiffly to see the stranger stepping through the end door of a carriage. There was no doubt about it. It was him. Ridiculous, Hudson protested to himself. He's dead. I saw him on the train, and the train crashed after I saw him. It can't be. But already he was eager to be off the train and had risen on legs which felt weak as spaghetti and staggered in the opposite direction, to be ready to lurch from the train as soon as it stopped. Rain smeared the fields beyond the glass as grey as the city pavements. His eyes flickered back along the carriage every few seconds to make sure the tall stranger wasn't heading towards him and couldn't trap him here in the end carriage with nowhere to go. By the time the train stopped, his heart was beating unbearably. He had to get help, he thought, hoping but not caring that there might be a refreshment area at this platform where he could sit and drink tea until he recovered. He couldn't take much more of this. But the platform, when the doors hissed open, was little more than that. A bench was sheltered, but the shelter stank of damp earth and worse, and a set of steps led down to a road between cornfields. He spilled out onto the concrete and bustled down the steps, almost falling over his own weak legs. Once on the road, he headed off up it, striding with as much power and determination as he could muster. The train was still at the station. He tried not to think why that might be as he walked, and then realised if the stranger was getting off after him, he would be a sitting duck out here in the middle of the road. Before he knew what he was doing, Hudson stepped off the road and began to march through the high corn. All around him it whispered like the sea. He marched briskly, not looking back, heading off in roughly a parallel direction to where the road had been leading. Sooner or later he would come to a village, and then he would be safe. Safe from what? What was happening to him? He couldn't honestly say. A stranger on a train? A man who should be dead? A ghost? His own life? His own fears? He marched as though trying to outpace his thoughts. When he noticed that his hands were reaching up around his neck and tugging off his tie, he blamed it on the stifling heat. But he couldn't say why he then cast off his overcoat, his jacket, his briefcase was long gone. Where? He didn't know. His fingers fumbled at his shirt buttons. Thunder rumbled and the dark grey skies began to unleash more rain. The train had pulled out of the station at last, and now, half naked and losing his mind, he was running towards it through the corn, because he'd realised something. He didn't want to lose Marjorie and Sam after all. They were his world, his reason for living. Whether there really was something rushing through the corn behind him, or whether it was just the breeze, didn't matter, and he wasn't going to stop running or even look back. Because there would be somebody sat on that train right now, looking out through the rain-smeared glass at him. And he didn't dare to think what might be heading back home to Marjorie and Sam that evening, in his place.